Ah,
There it is.
great.
There we go.
Okay, Amory, could you walk us through this, please?
Yeah. Now?
Yeah, it's a great way to start our conversation and let
Sure.
people jump in.
First
Yeah,
of all,
well-
if I could just say, you two have one of the best conversations I have heard in years, and I hope it spirals across the planet. It was just a consummate discussion. Really
Oh.
deserves a wide audience.
Good.
Well, feel free to share it as
I
wide
have.
as far as you can.
So
Tell all your friends. Go ahead. Sorry, Amory.
this is a 20 or 30-year-old sketch of how our concept of security, what it is, where to get it, who's responsible for it, has shifted over the past few decades. On the left, security during the Cold War was perceived as largely a military matter, on which we were then spending something like $11,000 a second in the US. Now it's about twice that. And that was linked to economic security and then appended from that militarized energy and economic policy, and subordinated to it were energy and resource security. So that's how something like 3/4 of US military expenditures not many years ago were earmarked for missions related to access to oil. And then environmental security, which now, of course, we link very much with public health as well and with equity, was very much subordinated and was indeed often considered harmful to the military economic security and prosperity access. However, a post-Cold War view on the right adds back in yellow the 4 missing links between these elements. And I'm not good at drawing in 3 dimensions, but think of these as vertices of a tetrahedron, an extremely strong structure. And prosperity gets generated all over because the wasted resources turn into prosperity and indeed peace. But I like to think in the middle of the tetrahedron is a surrounded kernel of justice, which is, as Dr. King said, is really the key, because peace, he said, is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. So just visualize that tetrahedron with something really juicy in the middle.
Jonathan, and hello, Carl. Long time no see.
Hi, Carl. Not the Carl.
Pioneer spirit.
You guys.
I have a quick question that I know Amory has been addressing for many decades, but you have such polarization in this country now that regardless of who gets elected November 3rd, there's going to continue to be the polarization. So how, as a consensus builder, hoping clearly that Biden wins, what could be a profoundly consensus building effort or initiative that goes to your tetrahedron? And I want to put out the idea that I've shared with Amory before, which builds on a lot of what his prior work, is to take the military model of being an islandable microgrid with the on-site, the super efficient, ultra efficiency, and solar and geothermal or storage systems, and have that become a U.S. sovereign-backed bond initiative to do in civil society, because the types of security threats that we face this century are now of a cyber attack nature that our large-scale systems of the past century have become the most vulnerable targets domestically. So I was wondering if you could, and my idea is that it would bring in the conservatives who are security oriented, but it would also be community based because it would argue for a distributed system that turns cities into mini platforms connecting neighborhood microgrids, buildings as nanogrids, and even electric vehicles as picogrids. So I was wondering if you had any comments on that. Financing it through sovereign bonds.
Yeah, and how you finance it isn't all that important, so don't get hung up on it. It's going to be a good deal anyway. You know, from the first century or so after Edison started the utility business, power plants were expensive and unreliable initially, but offered huge economies of unit scale, so they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And grids at the time were relatively cheap and reliable. But in this century, those bedrock assumptions reversed. We now have cheap, ultra-reliable generators and relatively costly, unreliable grid, where 98 or 99% of our power quality problems and power failures originate. So now it makes sense to generate power at or near the customers. That's the logic you're describing. And then it turned out that matching the scale to the need, which is largely distributed, also brought into play a couple of hundred diseconomies of large scale, economies of small scale, as in the smallest profitable book. So politically, this can be very attractive to those who care about security.
We have on this discussion one of the most visionary and effective driving forces in advancing human security and the rule of law at a global level, who was involved in the creation of the Millennium Development Goals and the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals, which emerged out of the World Summits of the 1990s. An integrated human security agenda. The first summit was on human rights. The second was on the environment in Rio. Then you had women in Beijing, and you had addressing poverty and social development in Copenhagen, and then you had Habitat in Istanbul, which is really the basis for the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wondered if we could ask Dr. Hans Karel, who's coming to us from Sweden, if he could comment about how do we get to create the energy, the economic, intellectual, political energy to move forward on the Sustainable Development Goals, and give us a little bit of like how they even came about.
Well, thank you very much. I've been listening to you and carefully, because this is a very complex issue. But for me, when I'm looking in the rear mirror and looking forward, and in particular my conversations with Kofi Annan, I come to the conclusion that if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there is one goal that you have to achieve in order to achieve all the others, and that's goal 16 on equal justice for all and the rule of law and anti-corruption. And this is why I think that one of the most difficult sort of things to beat here in the future is the corruption, is the even in the United States of America is now turning its back on the rule of law and so forth. So I think it's so sad, because unless you have a proper legal system, it is very difficult to achieve all the other goals. And I've been looking at these goals from various perspectives, law of the sea, certainly the polar regions and so forth. And since I left the UN, retired from the UN in 2004, I've been involved in trying to develop the rule of law. And there is now a guide for politicians on the rule of law. And the idea came from Helmut Schmidt in 2008. He was 90 years old when I was invited to discuss the rule of law with a meeting of the Interaction Council of former heads of state and government. And when I started talking about the rule of law, he, 90 years old, all of a sudden said, I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law. And this led the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden and a sister institute in the Netherlands to develop a guide on the rule of law for politicians. And it is now available, and this was my idea from the beginning, at no cost, freely on the web in 26 languages. Latest is Urdu from Pakistan. And you just Google rule of law, a guide for politicians, and you will find it on the web. And as I said, it's available for downloading and printing at no cost. Nobody should earn money on this. And all the translators had followed the first translator from Sweden, who said, this is so important, Hans, that I will translate it for free. All the other translators have done the same. And I hope that we will have more translations here. But I think the work that you do, and in particular, Jonathan, you are trying your best to deal with the nuclear problem, because here, when I look at the nuclear issue, I view this through the perspective of the Geneva Conventions. And I come to the conclusions that there's no way you can use nuclear arms without making a distinction between combatants and civilians. You will harm civilians, and that is forbidden under international law, according to the Geneva Conventions and other rules that govern the, shall we say, the way that you use force internationally. So I think that you really have to join hands. But when the United States of America is no longer in the lead, to me, this is a very, very sad story, because as a European, I never forget that who was it in the last century that came across the Atlantic to help us out of the mess that we had created, the First World War and Second World War? It was the United States of America. And now, who is at the rudder? Mr. Trump. And I must say, I never forget when I met with him. Kofi Annan called me one day and said, Hans, I think you'd better come up to see me at 2 o'clock this afternoon, because Donald Trump understands that we need to repair the United Nations Secretariat. And I'd like my legal counsel to be in the room when he comes. So there we were, the three of us. And I never forget how he behaved. Procurement, no, I'll just come and do it. And then he wanted to make what do you call it, the wall, one of these walls that he has on the Trump Tower. It's called, huh?
The border wall?
No, yeah, well, a border wall or something on the Secretariat phase to was zero. Sort of one of these walls that he has on Trump Tower. He didn't understand that the facade of the United Nations Secretariat towards the zero is a landmark recognized all around the world. He had no idea. So I didn't believe my ears when I heard that he was a candidate to become president, and then even less when he became president. And I know that John Bellinger is one of the initiators of the letter that 50 former senior Republican officials drafted on the 6th of August 2016, 3 months before the last presidential election. And the title of the letter were, "We are not going to vote for Trump." And they explained that he doesn't have the understanding, the knowledge, the personality to carry its function forward. He will become a security risk for our country. And of course,
Well,
this
One
has
week
begun.
language, see if the voters agree with you.
Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, and I mean, not only for his country, but for the world. So I'm so sad because for me, the United States of America was always the torch that when you came to New York, you saw the torch. It was risen not only for Americans, but all of humanity around the world. And what has happened? The US has to take the lead again to guide us through the problems that we have here. And I mean, you are experts in various elements. I'm a lawyer, so I've been working with experts in different fields, but I'm very careful listening to technicians, to experts, to the science, to understand when I give advice to the ministers of foreign affairs and justice in the past and to secretaries general, that I know that I'm basing my advice on true scientific basis, as it were. But sorry for being so long, but I just wanted to share my concern with you and explain how concerned I am at the present situation in the world. Thank you.
Hans, most of the media focuses on the weeds being planted in the garden. Weeds of bad policies, policies that create divisiveness, policies that squander resources and corruption. They miss the point that the whole garden is being uprooted, the garden itself. And as an American, you know, our Constitution has what's called the Supremacy Clause. It's Article 6, Clause 2, which makes treaties the supreme law of the land. So every time the head of state makes a mockery of the treaty regimes, which have taken years to build, he's not only ripping out the infrastructure or the garden itself, but he's undermining the very premise of the United States, because we're the first country created by a legal instrument. Our identity is not ethnic, nationalistic, or religious. It's legal.
Precisely.
And so that this administration has gone, it's as if an adversary wanted to destroy America without bloodshed. The consequence, however, is a lot of bloodshed in the rest of the world because of our development policies of claiming unlimited property rights over the global commons is causing the destruction of the planet with the climate. And the rule of law, the tool of law and morality are the only reins that we have over the capacity of technology and science to either help us flourish or destroy us. And the motto that I go to here that explains the whole thing, I think, is Pacta sunt servanda. Promises must be kept. It's the very basis of the peace amongst nations.
Of course. Of course. And it's interesting that you quote the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Paragraph 2, because I was invited to New York University, I think it was 2001, to have a discussion with John Bolton on international law. And in that discussion, he denied the existence of international law. And I had to quote the Supremacy Clause: treaties entered into by the United States of America become the supreme law of the land, and all judges are obliged to follow, etc., etc., you know. I mean, and I think this is an extraordinary provision in a national constitution, because I don't think many constitutions around the world has such a firm commitment to international law and the Roman concept of pacta sunt servanda. Treaties must be honored, as it were.
Promises must be kept. The entire infrastructure of business relates to that. That's why Trump has had thousands of lawsuits. There was a lack of fundamental respect, but now it's a systemic disregard. That, you know, the difference between a constitutional democracy and populism is essentially the framework of the guardrails of the rule of law, rather than, you know, popular tyranny, the tyranny of the crowd. I mean, this was the core argument in the creation of our country. I also wanted to comment, I've written several, sort of one of the landmark law review articles with scholars Charles Moxley and John Burroughs on international humanitarian law, which you alluded to with respect to nuclear weapons. And very simply, there's a body of law, and it's only triggered in war. It's the laws of war, essentially, that say you can't use weapons that inflict unnecessary, meaning beyond a specific military objective, suffering, that cause irreversible environmental destruction and are unable to discriminate between civilians and combatants. And so we argue by using the manuals of the US military services, which take them very seriously in each of the manuals of the Air Force and the Army and the Navy. But with nuclear weapons, they just ignore it. They just ignore it. And it's our argument that the actual deployments of the weapons violate international humanitarian law.
Can I ask, Jonathan, you and Hans, please to comment, given the importance of treaties and of international law, on how it is that a rogue president can simply ignore or abrogate or tear up treaties that his country has entered into without apparent process or accountability.
Well, I'll let Hans go first. Because I mean, in all full disclosure, I'm sort of a groupie of Hans Corell. He doesn't know that. There's very few of us, Larry Johnson and some of the other great, the people don't understand the importance of the UN as a background infrastructure for global commerce, for transportation, for communications, that even in wartime you can fly an airplane into airports all over because there's treaty regimes creating protocols for safety, that businesses can transfer trillions of dollars around the world because of the New York Convention on Arbitration, of course, deposited in the UN system. The whole system of communications, infrastructure, transportation has the background of the UN and the legal complexity that allows it to function. There's a handful of people, and Dr. Corell is one of them, that help make that, and which has brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I just want to honor that and let him go first.
No, I think this is right. And who were the ones who created the UN? It was Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. They discussed this already back in the 41-42 during the Second World War. And then you had the conference in San Francisco, where the United States was so wise that they sent a bipartisan delegation to negotiate what became the UN Charter. And as you know, the United States was one of the main engineers behind the League of Nations, created after the First World War. But the United States of America never became a party to the League of Nations. The Senate didn't approve of that. But when the UN Charter was brought before the Senate in July 1945, I think there were 83 votes in favor and 2 against. And I think maybe the other 17 or whatever, they were not present. But it was an overwhelming majority in the US Senate that approved the UN Charter. And I think that the UN Charter is a fantastic document. And when I last wrote about this in article last year, Security Council Reform, the Council must lead by example, I draw conclusions from the experiences of the years that the UN Charter is actually a fantastic document. The problem is that the member states of the United Nations do not bow to the law that they themselves have accepted. And this is what I think is so tragic. And as a matter of fact, I gave a lecture back in a few years ago in California under the title, "Who Needs Reforming the Most? The United Nations or its members?" And I think it's the members that have to look at their own performance here, because what they achieved in San Francisco back in 1945 is an extraordinary document. And then, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin D. who chaired the commission that elaborated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is an extraordinary document adopted on the 10th of December 1948, which is actually the foundation of all the treaties that we have now around the world protecting human rights. So I think this is something that has to come in company with what you who are experts in, for example, nature and the physical things in the world, that we have to sort of join hands here. And I've been working a lot in the Arctic and the Antarctica since I left the UN. I'm a member of something called the Arctic Frontiers that meets in Tromsø in Norway every year. And I was the chairman of the Antarctic Conference in 2005. And I mean, these are enormous regions. And many Americans, they just look at me when I tell them that the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continent. The ocean is 14 million square kilometers. The Antarctica is the opposite. It is a continent surrounded by sea, but the continent is also 14 square million kilometers. How much is 14 square kilometers? Is 1.5 times the size of the United States of America. These are enormous areas. And the climate change that we see now in these regions, I've been following this closely since I retired from the UN, it will have enormous effects on the globe. And the latest is that both Canada and Russia are very concerned that the melting of the permafrost will release CO2 in enormous quantities that these two states cannot pay for according to the Paris Agreement. So they have now a body that I'm following here that is examining how can we deal with this. I just mentioned this as examples of elements that you were experts in, shall we say, the various physical areas can assist by advising politicians about what steps to make. Thank you.
It's worth adding to that, I think, that the CO2 and methane releases from the permafrost, the melting of the Arctic sea ice and so on, were actually predicted and rather well understood in the 60s. A lot of that through the work of the great Soviet climatologist Mikhail Budikov. And this is not a surprise. This has been coming straight at us for over 50 years.
But there was, the question remains outstanding. How can a president go rogue, violate treaties, and not be held to account? Well,
Mitch
the
McConnell.
problem, pardon?
Mitch McConnell. There's no accountability on the check and balance system.
Yeah, the problem is that the so-called checks and balances system, the executive branch has two sections that are supposed to check him. One, of course, is the legislative, and the other is the judicial. The problem with violating treaties is the courts have not granted standing to claim injury. And there's dictum to the effect that if a fully ratified treaty is violated by the executive, one of the houses of the Congress as an institution might be able to bring a case. But the courts have said that even there's been instances where groups of legislators have tried to argue, well, we ratified this treaty, or we're supporting this treaty, and our representing the people of the United States is compromised by the violation of the treaty by the executive. And the courts have said that's not good enough. You need to get the entire institution itself as the moving party. So getting standing on treaties that we're talking about, security treaties, major important treaties, is very difficult. The other avenue of checks and balances, of course, is the impeachment process. But we just saw how a majority of the senators engaged in straight up perjury. They took an oath of, according to our Constitution, in an impeachment proceeding, the Senate sits as a judge and jury. The House, on the other hand, sits as a prosecutor. So an impeachment proceeding begins in the House of Representatives, which is adversarial. And the House itself prosecutes and begins the impeachment. The Senate, on the other hand, is supposed to, by the Constitution, take an oath of, senators to take an oath of impartiality. They sit like jurors. So the first and most important juror was the most powerful member of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, who said that he was going to coordinate with the president's office to ensure an outcome. And he said this before he openly took an oath of impartiality. Now, I wrote extensively pointing out that after the Civil War, when there was an oath of loyalty to the Union, there were senators who challenged the oaths and said, this is perjury. You know, Southern senator, are not sincere. And there were challenges. It was 20 years where there were challenges. And I must say, I was unable to get any Democratic senators or Republican senators to challenge the oaths. They could have challenged Elizabeth Warren, who said that she had already concluded, but then she backed off and said, but I'm going to listen. But Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham said there's no point in our listening. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in my opinion, suborned perjury. But in our system, to bring a claim of suborning of perjury, the only party that could do it would be the Justice Department. And the Department of Justice has been compromised and politicized. In other words, in many ways, the Trump administration has undermined the principles of the rule of law that the checks and balances system relies upon. And I've been unable to discern exactly what is the power that Donald Trump has over all of these people to compromise their common sense, their patriotism, and their loyalty to not just American values, but human values. Oath taking, and the oath taking by the oath is in the name of God. So they violated, they violated their oath to the nation, to the people, and to God. So if you'll look at this week's Newsweek, you'll see I have an article about how when Trump says lock them up, we darn well better take it seriously. This is not just hyperbole. Remember, this is the administration that is engaged in a crime against humanity by knowingly separating children from their parents when they're exercising their basic human right to seek asylum, which we honor by treaty and customary international law, which is people seeking asylum have a right to be heard and to seek it. As creating a hurdle to this basic human right, this administration said we're going to cause suffering to people who try to do this. And the suffering is, in my opinion, one of the greatest sins that humans can create, which is ripping apart the bond of a mother with her infant. This is one of the few things in the Bible where Jesus gets real fire and brimstone. This is destroying the faith and the well-being of infants. And this is a crime against humanity. And this was a policy. So when these people say lock them up, you have to take it seriously. I don't think we can overstate how precarious our moment is. It's very dangerous. It's not business as usual. These are people who lie in the name of God, who rip away children from their mothers, who absolutely are willing to give the property claims to our multinationals over the global commons, who are willing to ignore science in favor of myth, and who really have evidenced the callous disregard for the most basic tool of human civilization, which is telling the truth to one another. They openly make a mockery of that. So yeah, I think it's very, 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 very precarious. And as Dr. Carell has pointed out, the United States was the champion of the values necessary to move forward, albeit imperfectly. But we're not even at the table now. I mean, we're at the table in the following way. The administration last month put the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the very body that could prosecute a crime against humanity, on our sanctions list. Wait, I want you to grasp this. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is now considered basically being treated as a criminal without any due process hearing to defend herself. So we're undermining the rule of law and undermining the basic values of civilization. And I don't see how you can spin it and make it any more palatable. The question is, what do we do? What do we do when we win the election next week, God willing? It's the problem. The problem is the most demonic, ugly forces of racism, prejudice, and vileness have been let out of the closet. They're always going to be with us. Each of us as individuals, we all have a dark side. But we don't proceed forward and say that our most negative tendencies are our virtues. We don't lead with vice. We have to lead with virtue. And that's our problem today. And it's not an American problem anymore, nor is it really an international problem. I see it as existential to our species. And I would like to ask Amory, how far are we gone on the environment? Can we turn it around? Dr. Carell raised the issue of the permafrost, and I know the permafrost is going to release 20 times the amount of methane as fossil fuels. How far are we? Can we turn it around? And what needs to be done for, scientifically, what needs to be done and when?
Well, we need to do everything now because we didn't do it before. And even though a lot of these irreversible processes have been known for a long time, the climate science models have been conservatively understating their speed and their runaway potential for as long as we've had climate models. That's just a cultural issue in science. However, much less known, the models that translate climate science into consequences and choices, which are called integrated assessment models, have been at least equally conservative in understating what we can do to stop and reverse climate change, even to do so often at a profit, not a cost, which changes the politics. So when you put these two offsetting biases together, as we did in a paper last year called Recalibrating Climate Prospects, it becomes clear that what Jeremy Grantham calls the race of our lives, or the race for our lives, is very much on, and that despair and complacency are equally unwarranted. The rather important good news is that in energy and agriculture and quite a few other things that are causing these swelling disasters, what we need to do to protect all beings is cheaper than what we're doing now in the most narrow economic terms. It's more attractive to business. That's why, for example, of all the new electric generating capacity bought in the world last year or installed, 78% was renewables, or 81 if you had big hydro dams. It's why we had peak nuclear power output in 2006, peak coal use, these are global numbers, in 2013, peak car sales.
Oh, you froze.
2018, and in all likelihood, peak oil and fossil fuel use and peak CO2 emissions in 2019. It's why CO2 emissions have been flat in 3 of the past 5 years. And this year, the International Energy Agency expects that they will decline to an extent that undoes 10 years of their past growth. And by the time economic activity recovers to the extent it does, renewables will very all the growth, and that fossil fuels have probably tipped now into irreversible decline. And that in turn triggers a self-reinforcing capital flight from fossil fuels. So the coal industry already lost 3/4 of its value globally, 99% in the US. Oil is next, and just the last 2 days, there's been a flood of press reports about this accelerating stampede of investors out of the hydrocarbon industries. It isn't just shale, it's the conventionals as well, because there's no longer a good business case. There's too much risk and not enough return. It's exactly the opposite in efficiency of renewables. That's why this year so far, ExxonMobil lost half its value, and the biggest US renewables company, which is now bigger than ExxonMobil, gained 20%. In the last few years, it's gained 80%. So I think capital markets will be an important part of saving us, right up there with law. And Hans, I hope that you and others like you around the world in countries that have had such a good US relationship until these past few years are figuring out what you can do if Mr. Biden wins to welcome the US back into the international community and help us get back on the rails.
If I could just make one quick point, it also ties back in with both what Hans and Jonathan were talking about, rule of law and corruption and having to deal with that, because 3 of the solutions in the solution space are more inclined towards autocratic government. So you see, I was last year in South Africa when they were talking about an $80 billion nuclear deal with Russia. And of course, for a long time, there was, the finance, the treasurer said no, and so he was summarily dismissed. Unfortunately, it fell apart. But then also you have the export of large hydro from China, and both of these, as the international scorecards on corruption point out, go overwhelmingly because of the front-end capital to the autocratic government. So again, to the degree that the U.S. Can play a significant role in pushing a distributed model instead of a centralized model, it bodes well for getting the types of regulatory regimes changes that we need.
It's pretty easy to invite and have corruption with big opaque projects. It's much harder to do it if it's a granular project with zillions of pieces that are near our citizens so they can see what's going on.
One of the great changes in the world in recent hundreds of years was the Reformation in Europe, driven by the Protestant demands for individual liberty, which was both a spiritual claim of spiritual independence from the domination of the Catholic Church, as well as the domination of the capital markets. As Grotius, Hugo de Groot, said, I aim to make the marketplace and the monastery equidistant to God. Reminds me of your perspective, Amory, of that free markets can have a very, very positive effect.
And now we have a pope calling for divestment from the oil and gas industries.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so ironic. But where I was going with this is that you had this and by the way, the slaughter between Protestants and Catholics is what gave rise to the modern state. But what the dynamic for change was the moral claim of spiritual independence and freedom, that every individual is equal in the eyes of God. And two, the practical demand for the liberation of the capital markets from the domination of the empire. And so, I mean, you see it in the artwork of you go from The Night Watchman of Rembrandt, where it's regular people are the heroes. From the mythology of the previous artwork was all about, mythical figures or biblical figures. And this conjoining of the practical and the moral became compelling. And I would say that right now we have something similar to the domination of the capital markets with the military-industrial complex in the United States. That the idea of $700-800 billion a year in this one sector is just a distortion of a free economy.
And notice that actually the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us about, is not just making weapons, it's co-producing weapons and fear in a mutually reinforcing feedback that has no limiting counterforce.
No accountability.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think the new strategic triad, which has been very well received in the military and of course is foundation of military in places like Sweden, of conflict avoidance, conflict resolution, and non-provocative defense, could be such an interesting track. The more forward-thinking strategists in the Pentagon, Mickleby, for example, when he was there, are very astute and far-seeing in pursuing that line. And when I lecture at the military colleges, there's a pretty strong and favorable reaction that it makes a lot more sense than what we're doing now. So I think under the right leadership, we could end up with a big change coming from the military itself, but it takes a real commander-in-chief, and let's see if we get one.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, in the military also has a disproportionate influence on the political process.
That's why I like to make them a partner. It works extremely well at energy.
That's smart. There's another dynamic, which is $500 billion spent on advertising, convincing people to buy more stuff they don't need, and the basic economic model of perpetual growth, bumping up against nature. But Hans, I wanted to point out like the kind of leaders that the United States had coming out of the carnage of World War II. We had military leaders who said that, first of all, we had Marshall. Then we had General Omar Bradley, and let me quote him. "We live in an age of nuclear giants and ethical infants, in a world that has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. We've solved the mystery of the atom and forgotten the lessons of the Sermon on the Mount. We know more about war than we know about peace, more about dying than we know about living." I mean, it really comes, and then Eisenhower, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hungry and not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. And as always, it comes down to character. The touchstone is whether it's the military or politics or justice or law or medicine, it's the character, it's the qualities of people.
Jonathan, I think Bud Wilson wanted to get in a minute ago.
Oh.
Hi, Amory, and hi, Jonathan. Just a quick question in this context. I studied with John Kenneth Galbraith, and when he had first launched his book, The New Industrial State, and I just wanted to ask a question. I noticed that The New Industrial State is being reissued and updated, apparently either by his son or a group of economists. And I'm wondering if this reissuing of The New Industrial State could have some bearing on the discussion of the overbearing power of the military-industrial complex.
Well, first of all, I'd have to read the book to comment.
Sure. I was wondering if either of you were aware of that, because it could be something to keep an eye on.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've gone over time. Personally, I want to thank Dr. Carell for joining in, and tell him I'm going to follow up because I'm involved in a project on advancing human security in the UN system, trying to mainstream the concept. But I think we all need to give a shout out to Chip for convening these important conversations and bringing people together to actually share ideas that matter. And so I just want to publicly say thank you very much, Chip.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, Marie.
Yes, thank you, Hans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Jonathan. Nice seeing you.
I wanted to make one more comment, you guys, before you all leave. You can find that message that you just shared, Jonathan, from Eisenhower's quote, beautifully embedded in a song that John Denver sang with Alexander Grodsky. They did a duet, and it's called Let Us Begin. What are we making weapons for? And I just put that in the chat field. So you'll find that quote and that sentiment embedded in a beautiful song that's very powerful back and forth between Alexander Grodsky of the former Soviet Union and John Denver, because of all of his work with the citizen diplomacy that he was doing during the Reagan era.
Right. Thanks, Bud. I wanted to say thank you to Jonathan for sort of being the force behind this convening, both recorded and Q&A, and Amory for taking your valuable time. And I just want to say that we have 7 days before our nation will determine the outcome of this conversation. So I will tell you that I'm encouraged that the youth are getting out to vote. We just released another video that we did with Tom Steyer and Senator Ed Markey with 2 of the national youth leaders, Shea Bastida and Alexandra Villaseñor, that is now being pushed out in Dallas, Texas on EarthX TV. It's going out on the Unity feed. And so this is all about encouraging the youth to get out the vote. So hopefully we'll all vote, or we've all voted already, and we'll be able to encourage all of our friends to vote before or on the 3rd of next week. Thanks so much, everybody, for your time and your attention.